We look at how John talks about the resurrection. We look at how Daniel talks about the resurrection. We see the scripture writers talk about one resurrection. So, why would we expect then that there would be multiple resurrections talked about in a symbolic book like Revelation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah, and the passages that Gentry is referring to would be Daniel 12:2, John chapter 5. I think it's Acts chapter 24, where if you were to read just those verses without any other passage in Scripture, you might assume that the resurrection of the righteous and the wicked take place at the same time. And what I would appeal to harmonize all of Scripture is something that is often referred to as prophetic perspective or prophetic foreshortening. And this isn't some sort of hermeneutical trick that was invented by the dispensationalists to preserve their system. If you read in my class, I actually quote Kim Riddlebarger and use his definitions, and I actually even use his illustration. Kim Riddlebarger, a millennialist, says, he lives in Southern California. He's describing looking out his window at these two mountain ranges, and he says, if I look at these two mountains from a distance, the two of them appear to be side by side. But if you were to drive closer, what you would find over time, as you got closer to them, that there's actually a geographical distance between them, so that the one is a lot closer. And so what he talks about, again, prophetic foreshortening, prophetic perspective, what is sometimes presented in the Old Testament, Daniel 12:2, that side by side appears to be happening at the same time. When we come into the New Testament with greater clarity, what we find is there's actually a significant gap of time that separates those two events. And there's multitudes of Old Testament examples that mills, post mills, and pre mills would all agree with. And so my response to that, what I think is that, it's the argument of the general resurrection, is that when you come to Revelation 20, you see, yes, there will be a resurrection of the righteous and the wicked, same order as what we see presented in those other three texts, but that there's a gap of time that separates the two. I think that's the only way to harmonize all that Scripture teaches, and to not do violence to any of the passages, and actually to appeal to a well-known hermeneutical principle of understanding that the prophet's perspective many times was to see things on the prophetic canvas side by side, and later in the New Testament see there's actually a significant gap of time separating the two.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense with regard to the principle of progressive revelation. You would expect, after you have a framework given, to then have more detail, and to use, Paul's terminology, mystery. You have mystery revealed, you have things filled in that we didn't know about. And it's not changing the definitions or changing the realities, it's just filling in the gaps or coloring in the lines so that we have, HD detail instead of just black and white.
Well, I think that's such an important point, Peter, is we're not saying that the New Testament changes the meaning of Old Testament prophecy. And that's an important point, because you do have some in the millennial camp who would use that kind of terminology of reinterpretation, that the New Testament, in effect, ascribes to an Old Testament passage meaning that it didn't hold in the Old Testament context alone. It reinterprets it. And so I'm just going to think out loud a little bit. There's a difference between saying, let me say it this way. If the Old Testament prophesies A, C, and E, there's a difference between saying, when we come to the New Testament, B and D are filled in as events that also happen between A and C and between C and E. That's not changing the meaning of A, C, and E. That's bringing greater clarity by setting forth events that take place during gaps of time that weren't clear. The problem, I believe, hermeneutically comes when you move from the Old Testament to the New Testament, when you interpret A, C, and E as meaning something other than what their contextual meaning as originally given in the Old Testament was, so that there's a reinterpretation, there's a change of the meaning. So I think that's an important distinction. I've been thinking about that. Haven't written on that. I'm kind of talking, here and there in the classroom, trying to talk myself clear on it. But I think that's a really important distinction.